Good evening, and welcome to you all. My name is Kirsty Trueluck. I'm the Executive Director here at Maine's First Ship. So thank you for joining us this evening, both virtually and here at the Bath Freight Shed for what is, I believe, our 5th presentation in our summer lecture series. So this year, this 8-part lecture series is made possible through the generosity of the Grill family. Mariah and Chris Grill, who live on the shores of the mighty Kennebec, have been longtime supporters of Maine's First Ship, and they look forward to the day when Virginia will sail past their home. Our in-person audience tonight has been enjoying the glowing sun and the lovely summer evening as Virginia sits at her wharf just outside the window. And we hope for those of you who are watching online, if you haven't already, that you'll find an opportunity to come down and join us here at the Freight Shed. Spend some time at our Jane Stevens Visitor Center and enjoy our City of Ships in the summertime. Maine's First Ship is dedicated to building and operating a reconstruction of the 1607 ship Virginia, sometimes called Virginia of Sagadahoc. This working reconstruction of the first English-built ship in North America serves as a springboard for us to tell the story of early exploration and settlement of Maine, of the first interactions between Europeans and the native people, and of Maine's century-old connection to shipbuilding and the sea. We respectfully acknowledge that while living here in Maine, we are in the homeland of the Wabanaki, the people of the dawn. While we cannot remake history, we can learn from it and move forward with the knowledge and respect. And part of that effort, in fact, 4 of our 8 presentations for this summer relate to aspects of the Wabanaki history or culture and to social and environmental justice. Building Virginia celebrates the accomplishment of the Popham colony, but it also allows us to open a new, more positive and inclusive chapter in the relationship between peoples of European and of Native ancestry. We look forward to continued exploration of the world that we now share. Virginia and her home here at the Bath Freight Shed are the foundation for a variety of educational and community activities, all aimed at bringing to light the intriguing and little-known story of the Popham colony. Our visitor center, located at the other end of this wonderful freight shed, which is also historic in and of itself, is open Wednesday through Sunday, 10 to 3. And our docents are eager to share the history of the Popham colony and to explain how we went about building that gorgeous ship out there. You can keep up with our activities on social media and on our website. And for online exhibits, and all of our lectures up to this point are recorded and there as well. So we encourage you to join our Maine's First Ship community as a volunteer and or as a supporter. From shipbuilding to community building, from academic research to fine art, our programs rely on the financial support and curious and compassionate businesses and individuals such as yourselves. And now to introduce tonight's speaker, we have Becky from KELT, Kennebec Estuary Land Trust, who's our co-host this evening. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Becky Kolek. I'm the Executive Director of the Kennebec Estuary Land Trust, and we're so pleased to be able to co-host tonight's event. And I have the pleasure of introducing the first speaker of the evening. Kate Dempsey has served as the State Director of the Nature Conservancy in Maine since 2016. For the previous 13 years, she helped lead TNC's public policy initiatives in Maine, first as Senior Policy Advisor for Federal Affairs, and then as the Director of External Affairs, where she managed the chapter's policy initiatives, public partnerships, and marketing efforts. Kate holds an undergraduate degree in government and sociology from Bowdoin College and a master's degree from Tufts University Department of Urban and Environmental Policy. It's such a pleasure. Thanks for joining us tonight, Kate.
Whatever. Hi, everyone. Great to see you. Wonderful to see Becky. I'm going to be joined by Molly Payne-Wynne in a little bit. She is our Director of Freshwater Strategy and Deployment. That's not her actual title, but that's what I call her right now. She'll introduce herself further. Becky, thank you for not going through the long bio. One thing I wanted to add is that I have the great pleasure of having lived somewhere near the Kennebec for the last 22 years. My husband and I first moved to Maine, back to Maine, and moved to Phippsburg. And then about 7 years ago, we moved into downtown Bath. So this has been a great addition to the community. And I do want to congratulate Maine's First Ship in this past year. It just gives me tingles to think about that launch. I mean, I was up on the dock and it was amazing. And it was just, I called Kirsty, I was like, I can't believe how many people are here. This is so exciting. So congratulations. So we're gonna go through pretty concise set of slides and conversation. So we really want to engender a conversation as much as possible. So those of you who are on Zoom, go ahead and put questions in chat as we go, and we will get to them in the end. And then, of course, anyone in the audience will call on you at the end. And we have a mic to help our Zoom friends. So tonight, Molly and I want to leave you with kind of 3 main thoughts. One, the first is that continuity of purpose matters, but we also need to evolve. Molly and I will share particular examples from our own history as an organization and our work today, and a bit of where we hope to be in the future. But most importantly, we want to emphasize that, there's a lot of talk about who's an expert. I kind of have dismissed that word. We're all learning all the time. Some of us focus on different things. I am certainly not able to build a ship, but I would love to learn more about how to do it. And so I think the more we can all see ourselves as constantly learning, the more we can be expansive in how we think about our work. Secondly, while we'll only talk about a few examples of our work, know that at the Nature Conservancy, we think about ecosystems and the humans among them as all connected. So whether we're discussing climate change, river restoration, partnerships, we're never thinking about those systems in isolation. And third, we'll hope to get into a conversation that by taking a holistic approach on climate change and the connections between forests, rivers, and oceans and people, the benefits of including all those things in our considerations leads to better and more dramatic results. So we're going to start with a little grounding of who we are as an organization, because I've learned not to assume that everyone knows all about us. Maybe. There, I'm going to use my hand. So Rachel Carson, the Nature Conservancy in Maine was founded by Rachel Carson in 1956. As you may likely know, she was an American marine biologist and nature writer. So one day, spring day in 1956, Carson was at the Wiscasset Inn with a group of other citizens, and they were looking at what they were seeing happening around the Maine coast. And they were looking at development and pollution and many other issues, and they were trying to figure out what they can do as citizens. And everyone had ideas, of course, and they kind of dismissed them. And then Rachel Carson spoke. She said, "What about the Nature Conservancy? It is the only group I know which is doing something practical about actually preserving areas." So that was in 1956. We're well beyond that, but I will also note, just because it's super interesting to me, that Rachel Carson came first, and I am now the first official female executive director of our own organization in this. So it's been a long gap between, we've had amazing people lead this organization, and I'm honored really to stand on their shoulders and on that legacy. And I'm thrilled about the work we're doing today. But why I want to mention Rachel Carson as a woman in 1956 is because I think it's really super important to recognize the impact she's had on all of us. And frankly, she spoke to the crisis at hand at great personal risk. She testified before Congress and was dismissed outright, called names, called a communist, etc. And she continued. She insisted on speaking about the issues she saw in a way that the public could absorb it, which was super important. So what really strikes me about Rachel Carson is that she knew marine ecology. She was an ecologist like someone like Molly, but she did not stop with that knowledge. She insisted on acting. And so I like to think, as part of our DNA as an organization, is that we dig deep into science, and we're redefining some of what that means, but that we also believe in action. So jumping forward, I mean, we're going to go back and forth between present and future. So today we're part of a global organization, and we are working around the globe. If you talk to anyone from the Nature Conservancy, and you say, what are you doing around the world? You'll say, we're working on the two biggest, what we think is the most complex and existential, I guess, threats would be the right word, for us all. And that is the reality of climate change happening today and this dramatic loss of biodiversity. But as importantly of what we're trying to accomplish, the why of what we're doing is the how. And hopefully we'll tell a few stories about that today. But I think what's important is, again, those tools that we use, the partnerships that we build. We as a global organization have the privilege of learning from each other. So if you're in Indonesia, you might be talking with our marine program director, and and vice versa. We're sharing knowledge all over the world. Today, we work in almost 80 countries, and we're in every state in the US. And we have a growing program in Western Canada, which is very focused, almost exclusively focused on conservation with First Nations in Canada. Very robust program in Latin America, and we can talk about some of that work all in the Q&A. So back here to Maine. So in Maine, we did start as a land conservation organization. Initially, we were focused on protecting places that were wonderful and beautiful and maybe had rare plant species or were important bird habitat. And over time, we shifted to using our ecological science, which we use as our base, to conserve larger and larger ecosystems, whether it was here in Mary Meeting Bay, down in York County with Mount Agameticus, and many of the coastal islands. This focus began to shift probably about 15, 20 years ago, as Maine had this phenomenal and quite unusual rise of the land trust movement. There was this transition from local volunteer organizations becoming professional organizations with robust volunteer involvement. But we really believe that groups like Kennebec Estuary Land Trust are so critical to the kind of quilt of us all doing this work, because Becky and team and their volunteers can really be responsive to community needs. And think about like this partnership as one example. It's like a land trust and a history organization, it's live history working together. And I think that's really why local land trusts are so essential. So as those groups became more professional, we were able to continue to partner with them, but we had to turned our attention to larger ecological systems, whether mostly in the North Woods of Maine, and then in the Gulf of Maine, working with fishermen hand in hand to restore the fishery, and river restoration. One thing most people don't know about Maine is that we have about 18 million acres of forest land. And unlike much of the rest of the country, it's held in private ownership. And so our work is mostly with private and more industrial forest owners or investment portfolio entities like Weyerhaeuser and formerly Plum Creek, or maybe your favorite college's investment portfolio includes some ownership of land in Maine. We also focus a ton on climate mitigation, reducing sources of emissions through policy, but also through place-based work. And we're very, very focused in climate adaptation. So Becky and I wanted to show this somewhat out of date poster and slide. And the reason we wanted to show it is that it gives a one-time capsule shot, which is from 2000 on my right, and then 18 years later. And again, a really great example of how much the collaborative work together over the years, as I said, continuity of purpose, has resulted in really tremendous conservation in this region. And we talk about for hours why that matters. So maybe we'll get to that a little bit later. One of the reasons it matters is because this river here is really in a phenomenal place today, especially compared to the past. But I do believe that the conservation that's happened over the last 30-ish years in this region has been essential to building on that health of this river. So Senator Muskie grew up in Merrymeeting Bay on the Androscoggin, essentially, and he certainly knew about dirty rivers. And because of his work and many other people's, it resulted in the Clean Water Act in the early 70s. And again, I just mentioned this for a couple of reasons. One, it's really important to remember the phenomenal work of the past and how crucial that foundation has been to our work that we'll talk about related to rivers. So one of the things we're really thinking about is how do we as an organization show up differently? And that means we're a big organization. We can come in and say, we know what to do. Come on, people, let's do it. And instead, really that is, when you're negotiating land deals, that's usually quietly in someone's office. And instead, how do you begin to bring that type of work into the public domain and bring more voices into helping direct what happens going forward? So one example of that is the Kennebec. The Kennebec is one of the nation's most productive fisheries, and it suffered a serious blow in 1837 when the Edwards Dam was built near Augusta. Industrialization of that river was happening at the same time. It decimated huge populations of salmon, sturgeon, which we may see today as we're sitting here, river herring, and other sea-run fish. You couple that with overfishing out in the ocean in particular, log drives, municipal and paper mill sewage, and other industrial toxins, there was just insult upon insult to the Kennebec. Again, I think, that's why Muskie was so remarkable in his and his colleagues' work. Some of you may remember in the 60s, there was a massive fish kill. And that was frequent. There were massive fish kills because of oxygen depletion in the system, and really the river had collapsed. Fast forward from 1972, because the water started to get cleaner, there was less industrial waste. Other organizations really committed to fisheries at the began to say, what would this look like if some of the dams in this river were removed?
About what year is this picture?
Oof, 20 years ago, 22 years ago, 99. Great question. Yeah, the question was, what year is this photo of the Edwards Dam taken? And where Molly and I are guessing probably 98, 99. Because in July of 99, the Edwards Dam was taken out, part of a settlement with our former nuclear plant that I just blanked the name of, but we'll, and then also the Fort Halifax dam came out in 2008. And that spurred a stunning recovery of what was nearly a dead river. And remarkably, it spurred more work here in Maine and frankly around the globe. And that also gives me tingles thinking about, I wasn't here at the time, but it has, again, Maine keeps changing the planet. So with that lead in, I'm going to turn this over to Molly. We'll do a little back and forth at one point. I will say that Molly came to the Nature Conservancy about 6 years ago. She and I were working together in collaboration with the Penobscot River Restoration Trust that you'll hear a little bit about. And Molly has an interesting background because she's Adirondacks gal, a lake gal, but she's become an ocean human. So over to you, Molly. I'll turn it to the next slide.
Thanks. Oh, I need those. Thank you. An aspiring mermaid, if you will. Yeah, so thanks, Kate, for that intro. So what you see here is an image of hundreds, maybe thousands behind them of river herring that are moving upstream as they do in their annual migrations every spring in coastal rivers in Maine. And Kate mentioned the removal of the Headwaters Dam and also the Fort Halifax Dam on the main stem Kennebec River. They really set a precedent for river restoration around the globe. And so nearly 6 million alewives now return to this lower Kennebec watershed each year. And it's one of the largest alewife runs in the nation. According to the Department of Marine Resources, approximately 3 million alewives have passed the Benton Falls fish lift this spring, which is the lowermost sort of main stem dam on a major tributary of the Kennebec, the Sebasticook. And those fish are swiftly swim past the former dam sites of those two dams that blocked their migration for hundreds of years. The Sebasticook River, so it's a major tributary of the Kennebec, now hosts one of the largest river herring runs in the nation, definitely in Maine, and attracts dozens, multiple dozens of bald eagles, ospreys, countless other birds of prey that are attracted to this sort of annual surge in life every spring. And my colleagues and I actually paddled the Sebasticook a couple of years ago, and we counted 75 individual bald eagles in one day. It was incredible, incredible. So the results of this particular lower river restoration have really exceeded expectations. And there are more challenges upriver for these fish species. And we really do believe that there's win-win solutions that can come to fruition if we continue to look at the Kennebec and sort of look at what it will take to restore sea-run fishes that really ultimately support our fisheries populations out in the Gulf of Maine. And in doing so, we can also innovatively think about replacing lost energy production with new renewables and address economic concerns of the communities along the river. And so one of the ways, or one of the reasons why we think this is possible on the Kennebec and other rivers in the state of Maine and elsewhere in the country and the nation is because we have a really impeccable example of what this can look like, and that is on the Penobscot River. So the Penobscot River Restoration Project began taking shape in the late 1990s. And that was really sort of aligned with the listing of Atlantic salmon as endangered under the Endangered Species Act in 1999, which happens to correspond with the same year that the Headwaters Dam was removed on the Kennebec. So lots of attention being paid to thinking about what actions were needed to prevent the extinction of species like Atlantic salmon in our rivers. Historically, Atlantic salmon on the Penobscot numbered in the tens of thousands annually. And this project on the Penobscot River actually evolved into what was really an unprecedented collaboration of the Penobscot Nation, 6 conservation groups, ultimately including the Nature Conservancy, 2 hydropower companies, and a group of state and federal resource agencies. And then the project elements were ultimately carried out by what was known as the Penobscot River Restoration Trust. And all told, this project included removal of 2 main stem dams on the lower Penobscot and the construction of a nature-like fishway that allows fish to route around a 3rd dam at a major tributary confluence on the between the Piscataquis and the Penobscot rivers. The results of this project have been pretty incredible. The project restored nearly 2,000 miles of critical habitat for the full 12 species of native sea-run fish that we have in Maine, all of which were present on the Penobscot and all of which are actually present on the Kennebec here. Many are probably swimming up through as we're sitting here. But it had a lot of direct benefits to also other wildlife species, renewed tourism and recreation along the river, and other economic opportunities. Importantly, the Penobscot River Restoration Project played a really critical role in centering Indigenous perspectives, especially that of the Penobscot Nation. And their homeland is on the Penobscot River, and they played a central role in the Penobscot River Restoration Project. For us at the Nature Conservancy, this project represents one of our early partnerships directly with a Wabanaki community and a Wabanaki tribe here in Maine. And the Penobscot project was massive in scale and really would not have been possible without the leadership and the broader vision of the Penobscot Nation. Learning from tribal members and leaders on this project in many ways has sort of been the origin of our commitment as an organization to deeper learning from Wabanaki people. And it started to allow us to see how our collaborative work can support so much more than just ecological restoration. It has the ability to restore healthy human and ecological systems combined. And really importantly, as is the case that we're seeing sort of play out as an impact from the Penobscot River Restoration Project, really has the ability to support and work to restore and recognize Indigenous culture, tribal access to resources for sustenance, food sovereignty, and education. And Kate, I know there's a story that you wanted to share in particular about this project.
Thanks, Molly. So I had the amazing pleasure of working on the Penobscot River. Part of my job at the time was to, frankly, raise the federal dollars needed to help this project move along. Altogether, we raised about $62 million. Half of that was federal and half of that was through private contributions. But more importantly, in some ways, as Molly talked about, we as the Nature Conservancy came into this project because of our ecological science driving us to the understanding that healthy rivers and the free-flowing rivers on the main stem especially, but then eventually further up, really benefits our fisheries, our ocean fisheries, our groundfish fisheries. So we took this ecological view. We had the political chops, we had the fundraising chops. And one day, in fact, I was in Washington, D.C. with our colleague, John Banks, who was at the time just retired, the Natural Resources Director at the Penobscot Indian Nation. And I must have been, I am not actually an ecologist. I play one on TV. So I turned to my ecologist friend, John Banks, and I was like, tell me a little more about what you've heard, the stories you've heard about what the river was like when your family members were younger. And I probably was getting super analytical. And we're sitting on a park bench in Washington, D.C. And he looks at me and he says, Kate, he just like shakes his head and he says, for you, there's the river and then there's everything else. You're doing your job. And he was an amazing colleague, wasn't putting me down in any way. But he said, for you, these are different things. There's like all these different things that you do. For me, as a member of the Penobscot Nation, I am the river. And honestly, that may have been the first time I had heard that concept that restoring a river was really about, as Molly began to say, about sovereignty, about cultural identity in ways that, frankly, I probably will never fully appreciate and understand. And as we began to learn that more and more and work pretty well in partnership, Molly mentioned the Howland Dam. It was in 2016. We were at this big ceremony of the bypass that Molly mentioned. The next day we had our board meeting and we were reflecting on the event and the investment we had made together. And myself and our board chair at the time looked at each other and our fellow trustees and staff, and we said, let this be the beginning, not the end of our partnership, our learning, our work together. And for you all at First Ship, I mean, it took you 20 years to get here, but let it be the beginning and not the end. So over to Molly again for more fun.
Yeah, so I'll skip back for 1 second. This image shows the initial removal of the VZ Dam on the main stem Penobscot River, and you see a Wabanaki, or a Penobscot Nation tribal member paddling a traditional birch bark canoe to watch the removal happen. That dam was removed in 2013, and the Howland bypass that routed fish around the Howland Dam was completed in 2016. And so here we are a number of years after the technical completion of the project. And we're still, it's been years since the completion of these core elements of the restoration project, but we're still very much learning how the impacts of this project play out, not only for the ecology, but also for people, and in particular, Penobscot people. For example, it's been really hard to learn, that despite the recent increases in many sea run fish, the fish still can't be consumed by tribal members who are relying on them for their sustenance because of the contamination in the river. And our eyes have really been open to the continued legacy of colonization in Maine, our responsibility as a conservation community, as individuals, to act today, and the incredible resistance and resilience of Wabanaki people in Maine. In 2018, the Nature Conservancy and several other conservation groups and land trusts were given a tremendous opportunity to really dig deep into this learning. We were honored to begin our learning journey, directly from many Wabanaki individuals through what is known as the First Light Learning Journey. And this really started a reframing of what we think of as our history. And I think it's really, for me personally, it's because of this learning that I get so much more emotionally invested and connected to this work, because I realize how far-reaching and important and critical the impacts are for Wabanaki people. So First Light is now a collaboration in Maine between hundreds of leaders, 65 organizations, and Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Mi'kmaq communities to relearn history, recenter Indigenous voice, and to return land, resources, and power. And we're committing to working collectively with the understanding that we're all stronger together, and to continue to focus on these three central tenets of that work moving forward. So First Light is not an organization, It's an organizing principle that many, many leaders from both Native and non-Native communities have committed to. One of the really key aspects of this learning journey is fundamental learning about land loss in Maine. And I think often when we think about land loss from a very strictly colonial capitalist mindset, that is sort of our dominant way of existing in this country, we often think about like stakes in the ground, actual land. But we're also recognizing that for Indigenous people, for Wabanaki people, land loss means so much more than just the physical land. It's also water loss, culture loss, industrialization of rivers and other natural resources that are livelihoods for people. So this map that you see in front of you shows the ancestral and traditional homelands of Wabanaki people in Maine in red. And you'll notice that that's the entire geography of what we now know as the state of Maine. In very stark contrast to that map, you'll see that today, again, in the same red color, this is the land base in Maine, in what is now known as Maine, that Wabanaki people legally steward. So it's about 1.2% of their ancestral homelands. So I'm going to just flip back 1 second because I feel like this is such a powerful contrast in maps. And so here you see a map of conserved and tribal lands in Maine. So the conservation community, TNC being one of the largest landowners within the conservation community and within the state, we own about collectively around 23% of the state of Maine. So compare that 23 to 24% to the 1% of traditional homelands that the Wabanaki legally steward. So as a result of the First Light 3 years of relationship building and resource sharing, moving forward at the speed of trust, First Light has supported the development of an independent Wabanaki Commission on Land and Stewardship, which is made up of chief appointed Wabanaki representatives from each of the 5 communities, tribal communities in Maine, and as well as established a complementary delegation of non-Native conservation groups, which TNC, through myself and my colleague Susan Caldwell, serve on the delegation. And both of those entities, along with the broader community of folks connected to First Light, are working together to expand Wabanaki access and stewardship of land. So there is really an incredible intersection and critical need for partnership with all Wabanaki communities in Maine when we're thinking about conservation work, and especially when we're thinking about river restoration work. As many, if not all, of the Wabanaki cultures here in Maine are centered on the river, and they are river people, and river is life. And so we've come to sort of realize over time that this work is not only about physically reconnecting rivers to the sea, taking out dams, creating fish bypasses, upgrading road stream crossings so that fish can swim underneath our roads. But so much of this work is about connecting people or reconnecting people back to their rivers. I'll turn it back over to Kate to round us out before questions.
Thanks, Molly. So this is a huge step for us as an organization. We, as Molly mentioned, we're the largest conservation organization in the state. We are the 13th or 14th largest landowner in the state, second it's industrial landowners, a few individual landowners who own a huge amount, 1 million acres or so each, the state of Maine, and then the Nature Conservancy. And so that's around 300,000 acres of land that we own and manage, and then many more that we kind of steward, as Molly mentioned. And we're the largest conservation organization on the planet. So I feel, as one executive director of our whole organization, a huge responsibility to encourage, push, hope for us to therefore live up to that responsibility of that amazing privilege of working for and being part of this organization. So as we look forward, Molly's given us a really great path on how we've kind of step by step done our learning, and we'll continue to do it. And similarly, in the conservation community, we are frankly just beginning to think about questions of environmental justice, equity, and recognizing, and really through much of this learning, that this separation, like John Banks said to me, like, you have this separation, it's all connected. So we're working hard to integrate these lessons into our conservation work. We're working hard to begin to partner with other organizations that really have much of their specialty and focus on nature-based education, youth activism. And I think in a way that means, let me back up 1 minute. As an organization, as the Maine chapter in the Nature Conservancy as a whole, we are seen as a kind of, back to Muskie, like that deer ago sense of the word, do big things, do them well, and accomplish a lot. And one thing I think I'm and the team are really thinking about is, what does success look like and how do we redefine it? We're still going to do big things. We used to only measure things in how many dollars we raised and how many acres we protected, how many river miles. And now we really have to think about, what other measures do we have to hold ourselves accountable to? And really, for me, that's why I start with Rachel Carson, because again, I mentioned earlier how I thought she was so brave. And those aren't my daughters. They could be. They're 21 and 17. And not only do my colleagues who just dig in every single day to do this phenomenal work and put themselves out there, but I get a lot of hope from these young people that we have the privilege of working with. And they school me every day, and it's great. And I think we need more of that collaboration between the ages. But I also just remember Rachel Carson, you know, I should have that picture of her sitting in front of Congress, and she's got the mic, and we've all been watching these hearings, so we know what they looked like today, but you know, it was pretty stark back then. And these young people that we have the honor of working with, some of our Wabanaki colleagues, I think about how brave they are. And I truly feel that Maine, through our collaborative work and through our partnerships that are looking very different today than they did when I started the Conservancy 20 years ago, really is breeding the next group of Rachel Carsons. And some days I feel like I should just get out of the way. But I think part of my role as the executive director is to be that bridge. And so Molly and I are going to end on this and open it up for questions, Kirsty.
So thank you to our speakers, and thank you to our audience here and abroad. We will have room in the chat, but I have a microphone and I'll share. Does anyone want to make a comment or have a question? I will just start. The comment that you said, Molly, you talked about moving forward at the speed of trust. I thought that was a really lovely concept. And I think Maine's First Ship also has its own moving forward with the speed of trust. You know, we're an organization that celebrates a history that is deeply embedded in the colonial ethos, and we recognize that, and we're trying to figure out our path forward as well. So that was a wonderful thing to think about. Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Do you think there's the political will in Maine to get this important work done?
I have lots of answers to that. Are you thinking about something specific, so environmental specifically? Well, that's up to all of us, right? I have the great honor of serving on behalf of the governor on Maine's Climate Council. Over, gosh, that December, right before, I guess, 2019, we were all in one big room, and it's like another lifetime. There was like hundreds of us in that room, and we launched at that time the beginning path for the Maine Climate Action Plan. Over the year, on a bazillion Zoom calls, together as a community of all of Maine, put together a climate action plan. That's super accessible now. It was very technical in the beginning, and it's become really accessible to the public. And the amount of progress we've made on climate change in 3 years in this state is remarkable. We have one of the most progressive renewable portfolio demands in our system of any state in the nation. Our forests alone, I should know this number off the top of my head, our forests, if we can keep them, they don't have to all be conserved, but they need to stay as forests, managed forests some places, conserved lands other places. They are sinking, they are grabbing carbon and keeping it tight. So we really need to, I do think we have the political will. It's, you know, I have worked in politics a long time. It's pretty easy to get discouraged. And this always seems like so not useful when I say it, and it's powerful. One thing we know from social science is the more you can have conversations with individuals about something you care about, you can see some connections together. So in the climate change world, what we really think about is making sure that anyone, easily 70% of the US population knows that climate change is happening. It's being caused by our actions. You would not know that by reading the newspaper or just even walking down the street. I mean, when was the last time anyone here, other than me, had a conversation about climate change? So I really encourage you, but bring it down to something you personally care about. You know, when do lilacs bloom? When does the ice come out on the Winnegans? Something that you're noticing. It is amazing the things people will say. Like, oh, when I was a child, we wore sweaters on the island at the 4th of July parade, and this year we were sweating. And what that does is it just depoliticizes things. Again, I worked in politics for years, so I'm not saying politics isn't something we have to engage in, but I would encourage all of us to tone it down in the sense of the interaction between each other, because I think there's a lot more hope. We just get it easily drowned out. So I am an optimist. These days, I'm sometimes a bit discouraged and frustrated and angry. And I have seen things that nobody thought was possible. So I do have hope.
Thank you.
We've numbed them.
I think the question that comes to mind, you use the term manage a lot, and I'm not quite sure what that means. And so in my mind, that would mean, do you have legal standing to sue a polluter? Can you initiate, can the Nature Conservancy initiate court matters, or even bring them to the attention of some people that might respond to that? And then I have another comment after that.
Excellent question. And Molly and I could spend about 100 hours explaining what different environmental organizations in the state do. The Nature Conservancy does not use the law, generally speaking, meaning the courts, to take action. Amazing organizations in the state like the Conservation Law Foundation, Atlantic Salmon Federation, will often sue, especially on the fisheries world, around Atlantic salmon and endangered species. TNC doesn't engage in that process mostly, and I think we play a very important role in being ready when the collective situation allows us to step in and use our skills, which are really complex negotiations with stakeholders, finding solutions that need a lot of people to come to the table, like the Penobscot River. That was a negotiation that came out of a lawsuit that we weren't part of, but then we were asked to join once there was a path forward. So we don't tend to get involved in lawsuits, but I do believe they're very important to kind of holding the flank so that organizations like ours can be kind of more in the solutions, different type of solution space.
In the 1970s, I was part of a group of people who were trying to propose that a polluter identified, or at least some manufacturer using water in Maine, would have to, for which they released something of detriment. It could be heat, or it could be some sort of pollutant, that they would have to extract the water for their purpose from downstream from where they were returning the water. Now, as you might expect, they were not very happy with these proposals, because it would require a lot of effort to do. It didn't go very far, but there were a lot of people who were proposing those sorts of ideas, creating some sort of a change, requesting some sort of a change. In the 1970s, there wasn't this great movement. There weren't a whole lot of people working on it. I just wondered if you have in the back of your mind any little projects of that nature that would perhaps be as much of public interest as well as effectiveness if they actually were put into place. Education, explaining, stirring up the waters, causing problems for other people if there's a problem to be used.
Want to begin?
It's a great, well, it's a really great question. I think times have certainly changed from the 70s, but a lot of the challenges are probably still really similar. And I think that, I'll just say that we work really closely with state and federal agencies on things like water quality issues. And so we rely heavily on their expertise. And as Kate mentioned, like it's often when we come into a situation where there is an opportunity and there's maybe a semblance of a path forward for an innovative and creative solution. In the case of the Penobscot River Restoration Project, I think that the Howland bypass, I largely think of that as a compromise, right? Ideally, the dam would have come out if we were only solely focused on Atlantic salmon restoration and reconnection to their critical spawning and rearing habitat. But we also had this entire community of folks who have lived and settled along the banks of the river and had very different ideas about what the dam served for their community and what the impoundment of the dam created in terms of a valuable asset for their community as well. So I think oftentimes there's not a silver bullet solution in any of these really big environmental challenges. And it really takes compromise and it takes long conversation and commitment of people from all sides of the equation to be in conversation together to carve a path forward together. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's sort of what I was thinking when you were, yeah.
So yeah, Molly is we're working on rivers and streams all over the state. Well, from here up. Another example though, this isn't exactly what you were asking. One thing Molly said that's super important since the 70s was the classification of health standard, water quality standards in the state, so grade A, grade B, et cetera. Those are really important to the regulatory system and those who want to take it to court. So those standards have, again, through people like Edmund Muskie and many of our state agency people have been then extracted around the world, well, around the country, and now very recently around the world, which is really fun. Another really cool example of us learning from elsewhere in the world is something that we call water funds. So you made me think of this because especially this really started in Latin America, is now being done in many of, in Kenya and Tanzania. In cities, people really hope they have clean water, right? In Latin America, the heaviest industrial user of water coming into the city is usually bottling companies, Coca-Cola or beer companies. So it's super expensive to clean water through an industrial process. And most places, that's what's needed. However, the other thing we know is that all of it's connected, right? Like we were saying earlier. And so the more you can conserve lands upstream from the city, the fewer dollars companies, governments have to spend on getting that water clean. Usually there's in that case in Latin America, there would be the bottling company coming forward with the Conservancy and government to find a path forward. Here in Maine, we've done something, we call it a water fund. We've done something differently, and the city of Portland water source is Sebago Lake. Portland is something like one of 35 water districts in the country that doesn't require EPA industrial level cleaning. That is because lots of undeveloped land around Route 302 and Sebago Lake. So taking that model, we have joined together with land trusts in the Sebago, Loon, Echo, Denmark region, the Portland Water District, ourselves and some other larger conservation organizations to come together with the hospitals, the water district, the breweries to say, how can we put more money in conservation upstream so we don't have to build huge infrastructure. So that's been a really great example of thinking ahead, because actually the hardest part, back to the politics, and we probably all are feeling this, people don't know what they got until it's gone, right? And so it's actually easier in Latin America and Kenya to get people enthused to act because they see what unclean water looks like and tastes like and feels like and what it does to you. And so in Maine, we're a little, we're super lucky that we're now at this place with all this clean water, some of which we drink, some of which supports fisheries, et cetera. So we can get a little complacent. So I'm really excited that the breweries, the hospitals, the water district are coming together on this.
I wonder if you could,
Yeah, you're awesome.
I wonder if you could just talk about maybe your top 3, 4, 5 projects with a horizon of 5 to 10 years in the state of Maine.
So why don't I tick off a couple and then so we have goals, right? So the goal in the next 3 to 5 years is to collectively, with a lot of our investment, conserve 300,000 acres of forest in Maine. Much of that will be through our acts, but sometimes it's supporting a partner. We Molly can tell you some of the specific projects, but our goals for river restoration is another 1,000 miles of river and streams connected in the state. Ocean, I could talk all day about our oceans work, but most importantly, we work directly with brown fish fishermen, so cod, haddock, etc., right here in Cundy's Harbor, Port Clyde, to work together through a long investment strategy to rebuild certain fish stocks to what are called sustainable levels. Again, we do this through investments with fishermen. We buy fishing permits and then lease them back to the fishermen, kind of like a forest easement. We ask them to work differently. And then together we've influenced the policy arena so that those fisheries are monitored in a totally different scheme, basically, and that's happened in the last year. So we have very specific conservation goals. I could talk about specific projects, but why don't you talk about maybe the St. Croix or maybe some of the.
Yeah, so we do have this like really lofty goal in terms of freshwater conservation, in terms of reconnecting miles of river and stream habitat. And that is anywhere from, main stem dam opportunities to smaller road stream crossings. So like you've probably driven over a number of culverts to get here today. And one of the things that we know is really important is reconnecting the headwaters habitat for these species that need that for spawning and rearing. And often that's small rivers and streams that are very often there are undersized culverts that allow our roads to go over. So sort of prioritizing how do we get the biggest bang for our buck collectively while also improving flood risk and municipal infrastructure through those projects. I'll just say one of the other sort of higher goals that we have as a chapter that's not a specific project is really focusing on supporting Indigenous communities here in Maine. So uplifting the voice, choice, and action ways that might touch down in any number of our projects is really thinking about, how are we incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing into our Western science view? So how are we continuing to support and provide space for Indigenous knowledge into how we're prioritizing and decision-making around what are the key projects moving forward. And the Scoodic River or the St. Croix River on the border of Canada and New Brunswick and Maine is one of those places where we're working directly with the Passamaquoddy community there on both sides of the border, really understanding what are the central priorities in order to see river restoration and watershed scale restoration take place there.
One overlay or thread that I'll just add to what Molly said is, I mentioned climate policy earlier. However, one thing I think we're really trying to emphasize is all of this work is climate action. So as I said, forest conservation is a carbon sink. So we look at all of our work through a climate lens. What's it going to, kind of back to that, what's it going to look like in the future? What's it look like now? How does river restoration help? What do we need to do in the ocean when the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 99% of the oceans in the world? But the other things we do is trying to be at the forefront of thinking about how we as a state can take other types of action that also lift up more rural communities. And so, in Maine, unlike actually many states, 50%, at least 50% of our emissions are from cars and trucks. And if you live in Jackman, it doesn't matter what I say, you're not getting out of your truck. And therefore, how do we create a system that allows electrification of the entire grid to happen. And then in places where people really depend and our rural communities will dissolve if they can't stay connected to all of us and all of us staying connected to them. How do we make sure there's the infrastructure there to allow rural Mainers to move about and get jobs, et cetera? And just super quickly, electrification. I also could talk for hours about this, but we do need to think about that as a New England region, because when we have offshore wind, that will be super important to the grid. We need it. We need to work with fishermen so they have a voice in it. And a lot of that electricity will not come to Maine. And that's a super hard thing to deal with when you're super fierce independent state and people. And so how do we as a New England region begin to think about ourselves as collectively in it together? And that's not a project, but we do have some efforts underway. We good?
Yeah. I'm going to, I think we're done sharing. So thank you to our speakers, to Kate and to Molly, and thank you to our audience here and abroad. It's really wonderful to have you here. I really appreciated the way you wove together all these elements of sort of who we are and our volunteerism and this notion of like really wanting to grow as an educational organization, and the way you talked about the way you have grown as an organization, and really bringing in again this theme of environmental and cultural justice. Really, really powerful. So thank you to all of you. I can't wait to share this recording around with some people who couldn't make it tonight, both the fish lovers and the Penobscot Indian folks I know, and lots of opportunities here tonight. So thank you. Again, please come back and visit us. We have 3 more of our regular lecture series, and then we also, the Maine Humanities Council has graced us with the Maine Speaks. So we actually have a bonus this summer. So go check out our website. Keep an eye on our social media. We have so many cool things. We're going to be at Colonial Pemaquid, speaking of Colonial, in July 30th. So we just want to do lots of cool things. And meanwhile, the ship is, construction continues and rigging continues, and systems, outfitting happens. And no, we can't sail the day after we launch because no one does that. They have to finish getting ready. But we look forward to getting ready for future sailing. Like, just so fun to share it all with you. So thanks for coming, and thank you all. All right. Have a good night.